Good morning, students. Yesterday we had seen how the Mesopotamian civilization was so dexterously and so carefully was maintaining all the records in their tablets, and how they had developed and literally invented the whole system of writing. And this system of writing was came about because now a lot of things, because as the society became more complicated, it became more and more expanding in its mode. Naturally, a lot of things had to be now recorded, documented, because everything could not be remembered by people. It would be a very difficult task, and it was actually a very difficult task. Now this is where Mesopotamian civilization, though it is our Indus Valley civilization was a contemporary of theirs, but this is where Mesopotamian civilization actually takes a lead, because they were so good at recording everything. That is, as that's what you see in this paragraph here. That is, this is why once the surface dried, signs could not be pressed onto a tablet. So each transaction, however minor, required a separate written tablet. And this is why tablets occur in the hundreds of Mesopotamian sites. And it is because of this that wealth of sources that we know so much about Mesopotamian than we do about contemporary India, because at that point in time, the contemporary India was Indus Valley civilization, and we have so much of knowledge about the Mesopotamian civilization, but not much about Indus Valley. And we know about their famous kings. We know about the first storybook that they wrote. In fact, the Legend of Gilgamesh. All of this we know. In fact, the Legend of Gilgamesh, considered to be one of the earliest stories ever written, you still have them preserved. And how do we know it? Because you still have them preserved in tablets. The Legend of Gilgamesh, which was documented in 12 tablets. So that's, you see, we know even the stories that they were telling their children and telling each other, but we have no idea about Indus Valley civilization. Now, coming to the second paragraph, the important point which yes, this one, Sumerian, the earliest known language of Mesopotamia, was gradually replaced after 1400 BC by the Akkadian language. Cuneiform writing in the Akkadian language continued in use till the first century AD. If you look at the map, that is it very clearly would show you in the previous page there, the maps which you see there, that where is Akkadi. Okay, it is again in the area around river. These towns are basically the Uruk, Kadi, Assyria. All these places are near river Tigris and Euphrates. Okay, the system of writing, I think the most important thing is the last line here. Thus, the signs that a Mesopotamian scribe had to learn ran into hundreds, and he had to be able to handle a wet tablet and get written before it dried. So you can also use your common sense and understand that, yes, of course, it is very important, because you can only write on the clay when it is wet. Otherwise, the moment it dries, it would be very difficult, and after some point, it would be impossible to write anything on it, because you have to understand all these places are hot places. These are not cold places. The sun is strong, it's harsh. Okay. uh, then we come to the topic of literacy. Very few Mesopotamians could read and write. Not only were there hundreds of signs to learn, many of these were complex. If a king could read, he made sure that this was recorded in one of his boastful inscriptions. For the most part, however, writing reflected the mode of speaking. As you all know, all the kings would, and they always wanted great things to be written about them. And naturally, if it was being done by their own members of the administration, they would also ensure that they have a very pompous attitude to the greatness of their respective kings. Now, uses of writing, that is the next chapter, or I'm sorry, the next topic. uh, uh, you have to understand one very, and that's what again brings us to the topic, that there is so much that is documented about Mesopotamian civilization. The connection between city life, trade, and writing is brought out in long Sumerian epic poem about Enmerkar. one of the earliest rulers of Uruk. We have no idea about even about the ruling structure in Indus Valley civilization. Here we have even the names of the rulers. In Mesopotamian tradition, Uruk was the city par excellence, often known simply as the city. Yeah, here Enmarker wanted lapis lazuli and the precious metals for the beautification of a city temple, and sent his messenger out to get them from the chief of a very distant land called Arata. Now, a very distant land called Arata. Now, these are two things. This sentence actually tells you about two things. The first thing is uh, uh, the people here were affluent. Okay, people here were affluent, they had the resources. Now that means they had taken care of the basics, and that is why now they could set their eyes on the grand construction projects, and not just set eyes on realizing them, but also to ensure that if the precious items for constructing them were needed, they could get it from different and far away lands. And the distant land that here that we are talking about is Arata, which is not very clearly defined by them, but it is believed that Arata was a place somewhere in western India, because Mahabharat makes mention of that. Okay, so it was somewhere, it was certainly not a Mahajanpada, but it was somewhere in western India. Okay, yes. So you can imagine, if they needed some precious stones, they were sending their people to such far away lands, clearly showing that yes, they were an urban settlement, they were affluent settlement. Okay, and one thing which I would like to Uruk happens to be also one of the because you have to understand that it was almost the twice the size of our largest settlement in Indus Valley civilization. Okay, it was almost twice the size of that Mohenjo-daro. Yes, so you have to understand that Uruk was a huge settlement, and it was and at that point in time, in those years, you have to understand, almost about good 5,500 years ago, they had almost 100,000 people there. And it was a very prosperous place where the town had expanded. In fact, if only if we were in class, I would have told you about the downfall of Uruk as well, and how relevant it is to the modern environmental problems that we have around the world. And Uruk is one of the first documented cities, major cities, which perished because of poor planning and environmental deprivation. Environment really took its toll on Uruk, because they were expanding at a mad spree. They stopped worrying about environment, and then the water got contaminated, and the whole land was now started it turning into an arid land, and ultimately Uruk just uh, lost its place in history. Okay, urbanization in southern Mesopotamia, temples and kings. Now, yes, students, all the contemporary civilizations, not just in Mesopotamia, Egypt or Indian, but in India slightly later, all the contemporary civilizations, and even now, all the rulers, they want, once they would like to leave a legacy, and the best way to leave a legacy is to construct temples. Because in earlier times, the rulers was always they were always considered to be the representative of God on earth. So it was imperative for them to come up with grand structures and grand temples and grand buildings which housed the statues of gods. Okay, so the first sentence: from 5000 BC, settlements had begun to develop in southern Mesopotamia. The earliest cities emerged from some of these settlements. They were of various kinds: those who gradually developed around temples, those that developed as centers of trade, and imperial cities. It is the cities of the first two kinds that would be discussed here. Now, In 18th century and 19th century, if you talk to your grandfather, and if you talk to your nanaji or your dad, even for that matter, they would tell you that today most of the towns, the major towns that you know in India, and it was the same around the world, they developed around the railway stations where the trains used to halt in different routes, where the trains used to halt. The cities and the towns and the small towns started developing around those railway stations. It was that is, now we are talking about the modern times, but in the earlier times, that's how it used to be. Once the temples, the grand temples were erected, you had a whole city that depended on the temple, because it used to get devotees from far away lands, and there were many people who would come to pay their blessings, and to would come for praying and everything. So naturally you needed rest houses to house them, then the hotels would come up, then the shops would come up, and then better transportation needed to be taken care of, because so many devotees would be coming from all across the place. So they were temple towns. Even in India today, there are many places. For example, Vaishno Devi, you go, it is all about religious tourism. You go to Ujjain, then because of Lord Shiva's temple, then you most of the, for example, Ajmer Sharif, most of the people go there as tourists because they have to visit Dargah. And in similar fashions, it is across Madurai. People always go there for the great temple of Lord Goddess Minakshi. So these are temple towns, and all this book is trying to tell you is that temple towns are not a new phenomena. They have always been around. Okay, people who would like to be, and like to be there, pray their gods, and the rulers and the emperors knew it, and that is why they would construct grand buildings and house the gods, the favorite gods. And in those years, because most of the economy was around agriculture, so most of the biggest and the greatest gods would be the sun god, basically the gods of weather, the gods who would determine good crop, good harvest, rain gods, sun god, those kind of gods. Tomorrow we will take the other part of the chapter. Thank you.